your opportunity to put questions to our two panellists.
Thank you very much. My name is John O'Brien from GHD. Enjoyed both presentations, but particularly Stephen, your comment about the US is also my experience, and I'm of the view that what is driving that US resurgence is a couple of things, but in particular low energy and flexibility, low energy price and flexibility in employment. Is there a lesson for Australia? Because in some ways we do have similar economies that we can learn from that model of low energy, therefore not putting additional costs on energy, and creating greater flexibility in employment.
I think we have been learning and making choices about the American model here in Australia for many decades, and we run a model somewhere between Europe and America, and we're getting outcomes actually right now that aren't too dissimilar to that model. That is, we don't want the brutality of the American model. We need a social safety net, and we've made choices around that as a community. And with that comes some economic inflexibility, and some times when that ends up in showing up in economic performance. We should always test the people, but also there is questions of leadership. Now, the big thing that's new about that choice for Australia, about flexibility in your economy versus social fairness and all the other bits, is that it's different now, say from 30 years ago, is that we're in a global economy where, as I showed you, 60–70% of the world's wealth is being generated in emerging markets, and they're pretty competitive and they're pretty tough, and they'll do anything to succeed. And I think this is one of the problems in Europe. You just can't have the work practices and some of the social and economic framework and then expect to compete against Southeast Asia for manufacturing capacity. So the world is changing, and we need to test that. It's one of the key roles of our political elite, our political bodies, is to help make those decisions. It gets to a point that was raised this morning. I sort of raised it, but John Hewson was getting at it, is that can we consciously get ahead of challenges in a democracy, or do we have to wait till a crisis hits and they're forced upon us? And that's also difficult. So that would sort of be my perspective on it. I totally agree with you, though, that the United States is progressing and recovering because it has been able to take some very, very tough decisions as a community, which had a significant human cost at various times in the last 7 years. But they've made adjustments and they've moved forward. The other example is Ireland versus Greece, or Ireland versus Portugal. Ireland's making progress, but I think their public servants took a 20–25% pay cut or something like that. Treasurer, how do you want to go with that one? It's unheard of in this country. So look, they're the choices we make.
Really good question, and I almost thought it was a Dorothy Dixer because the answer is yes. But I think if we drill down and look at some of the real things you're talking about with industrial relations and workplace flexibility, I come back to the issue of not making it sort of a divisive policy or a divisive way of looking at these things. If we take something like youth unemployment, young people who can't get their first job, nobody would say that's a good thing. That's not something that would divide along party lines. The solutions are always a little bit problematic. Personally, I believe that we should have a lower youth wage. And I would defend that. You know, if I was given the opportunity to rule, that's what I'd like to do. But I would like to go and hear who's got problems with that, who is it going to hurt, and let's understand how do we fix it. Because the reality is very few young people have jobs. The only people who are going to be hurt, disadvantaged by that ruling and that decision, will be the few young people who do have a job. So let's fix that problem. And I think that we do have to have a general view that we are overall wanting more people working. Work's a good thing. If we have that view, then we work through all of the little wrinkles rather than taking the sort of divisive stance that we're seeing now and making it a political decision. So, yes, but that needs to be done by a leadership that says this is where we're going, but let me understand why that creates fear for you, and let's deal with that particular fear.
Aaron Johnston from Cement, Concrete and Aggregates Australia. Thanks for the presentation, Warren and Michelle. I've got a question about the levers which are available for state governments and federal governments in terms of addressing economic growth and economic prosperity. What do you think are the most economically advantageous and politically palatable options are for state governments and federal governments to foster economic growth?
Yeah, I've got all the solutions, sure. It's a big question.
He actually does.
Treasurer? So look, one of the things that really strikes me is I don't like this idea of austerity, but the financial sense of getting our recurrent budgets in play is very important, and then the governments can go out and borrow as much money as they want for infrastructure. If the market system is failing us, and there's evidence that it could be, that the private sector is not driving economies forward because of conservatism, because of psychological factors, if that's an issue, and America is the real test bed of this right now, if this US economy rolls over, then that'll really raise this issue. Then it will be up to governments to play this role in leading growth. And you know, this is in a community that we've spent a lot of time trying to reduce the role of government over the last few decades. But we're in a unique crisis point in the world, things like quantitative easing and all this sort of stuff. So look, I think that could be the big one, and it's not through transfer payments. That will bankrupt our government as well as our people. That's a crisis issue, like a GFC type issue. It's not to be, now we need the infrastructure piece, I believe. So I think that's important. But then again, there's reform of the economy, generally speaking, of industrial relations, of red tape, of the way business practices occur, of giving incentives, and you could even go to the other extreme of industry policy, of trying to promote certain industries. So these are all on the table. The one thing, we heard this from John Hewson this morning, is, and we've heard it from the Governor, is interest rates can only do so much. And we may get another rate cut, and people like me and Banks will fascinate over it, but that's not going to solve the issues of long-term productivity growth and long-term growth. It's around infrastructure and structural reform.
Look, I'm not an economist, but I have a view anyway. I think we mustn't forget the power of small business. And I think America is kind of heavily driven by small business. Small business has this amazing capacity to just work harder when you have to. So I think we must always remember the power of small business, facilitate small business to do things. And a somewhat related issue, and I'm thrown by whether this is a state issue or whose job it is, but the cash economy is no longer something that's so small we don't need to worry about it. It relates to small business. If business is too hard to do, real business, legally, then small business goes into the black economy, the cash economy, and that's no good for anyone. So the two issues to me are related. Make it easier for small business to do terrific things.
I think I'm an economist, but my view is that one of the elements about stimulating the Australian economy comes to what people have referred to today, and in the graphs that we've seen, show manufacturing declining. I think that's old manufacturing. I think that's traditional manufacturing. And what we have to be about in this country is the new generation, the next generation of manufacturing, high end, high skill, high value, high wages, low employment levels, international connectedness, as we showed in our report last year on advanced manufacturing in this country. I think government policy has got to be directed to that. I was interested last week, I think, the newly promoted Parliamentary Secretary in the industry portfolio was saying similar sorts of things. There was a need for government support in R&D, in STEM, and all these other things that are going to make us internationally competitive and to build on what exists in small business particularly, because most of these high-end value-added advanced manufacturing industries are in fact small to medium-sized businesses that need that support. So as an added bonus to what we should be looking at, and where governments can give support, it is putting in policies whether it be through the taxation system. I mean, the bill that went through the Parliament the other day that took away some of the R&D concessions on the big companies in Australia and rather redirecting it to small, medium-sized enterprises, perhaps that's a step in the right direction. Perhaps that is going to aid them. But there needs to be something like that and a bit more of that to stimulate that element of our Australian economy which has perhaps not been as valued as highly. And certainly as we look into the future, as the future is going to be shaped by digital disruption, it's going to become even more critical. Other questions I have over here to my right. Thank you.
My name is Greg Hoffman from the Local Government Association of Queensland. My question is to Michele, and it's to do with public opinion, public reaction, and what the polls may be saying, or whether there is within polling obvious changes in the demographic responses. You know, we're having debate now about personal interest, self-interest versus public interest, national interest, significant swings, changes in government in one term, you know, significant moves on governments in their first term. I mean, what's your assessment, or is there any evidence within polling that's showing this is driven out of a particular demographic, or is it more broadly based?
That's a lot of changes. Look, I think broadly what we're seeing in terms of social trends, we all know we have an ageing population, a growing and ageing population. The baby boomers are moving into the 65 plus, so that's one piece of the puzzle. We have an increasingly educated population. So that means a couple of things. It means that youngsters are staying at school longer before they actually go into the workforce. It means that people are hitting the world, questioning everything increasingly. You know, if you have people who are not well educated, they're less able or willing to question things. These days, most people are questioning, disbelieving, and, you know, they're just a lot more voluble in their concerns and how they see the world. And so those things are driving a lot of this change and query. We're also seeing quite clearly that Australians are becoming more progressive, socially progressive. So that means they're more open-minded about whether it's technology or test tube babies or, you know, marriage is now in the minority, for instance. All of those socio-sexual things, we're becoming more open-minded. So those sorts of changes are actually driving a critique of our leaders. And I think one of the struggles probably is that, you know, it's like as children, you think, when I'm a grown-up, I'll be able to do anything I like. And then when you realise that you're not the boss, you think, I wish I was the boss, I could do anything I like. Then you're the CEO and you realise there's a board, and then you're the board, you can't do anything. So we're all really good at being, we are. Isn't it true? I mean, who's running anything? But yeah, I hadn't thought about that before. But we are, as a nation, critical of our leaders, and we're very clever and you know, good at framing these criticisms, and the leaders are not necessarily any better than they've ever been at responding. And of course, with social media, with the internet and all the kinds of volubility of people, everybody's thought is being aired. And once a thought seems like a clever one, it may or may not be clever, it may or may not be helpful or valid, but if it's kind of cute, it will get aired. So, you know, it's a pretty hard gig to have, you know, to be in a leadership position and have everybody throwing stones at you, and then to be expected to sort of have another shot at it, think in a long-term way. So it's a lot more difficult. People are a lot more critical. I don't think it matters. I think the leaders have to say, be that as it may, my job is to run the country, or my job is to run the state. I'll do it honestly and fairly, and I will do my very best to take the people with me, using all the forms of media that they need.
Unfortunately, I'm getting the signal that we have, in fact, run out of time for questions, which is rather unfortunate. There was one other hand at the back. I apologise.